So thank you so much for having me. This is super exciting. This is a brand new paper, basically so brand new that when I sent Marcus the title in the abstract, I didn't realize that I had missed a large swath of the literature that more or less answered one of the questions that I was trying to answer there. So we're going to do something just a little bit different today, but it's all right. It's still going to be fun and exciting. So I think what I said in the abstract was that I was going to tell you how to distinguish between metalinguistic negotiations and merely verbal disputes. And instead of doing that, I'm just going to tell you when merely verbal disputes are worthwhile to have. So yeah, that's what we're going to do. There we go. So traditionally, folks have held that merely verbal disputes are not worthwhile. So these are disputes where participants might be talking past each other, and it's because they're misusing language, or not misusing language, but they have a miscommunication about language in a particular way. So let me, taking like a silly example, my students these days have been talking about what a sandwich is. And whether things like a hot dog could be a sandwich, or an open-faced sandwich is a sandwich. And in a really pretty major way, this doesn't matter. It doesn't matter whether or not a hot dog is a sandwich, because really nothing hangs on it. And what's at stake here is how to define sandwich, not really anything about like the nature of hot dogs or anything. So these disputes are kind of pointless in a way. They don't get us anywhere. They don't help us learn anything about the world, that kind of thing. So traditionally, folks thought that that meant, well, we shouldn't bother having them. As it turns out, and this is the thing I discovered, there's a bunch of literature, new literature that's all really cool and really exciting, where people disagree, right? So it's not that merely verbal disputes aren't worth having, it's just that some merely verbal disputes aren't worth having. And so what I want to do is take that on board, right? So there are some really verbal disputes that aren't worth having, but some of them are in fact worthwhile. There are stakes to them, things hang on them, they can teach us more about the world, that kind of thing. So what I'm going to say then is that the folks that disagree are mostly right. There are worthwhile merely verbal disputes. And what I want to point to today is a feature of merely verbal disputes that I think can help make the difference between being worthless and worthwhile. So I think that when disputants are cooperating in the right kinds of ways, we can make it can sort of move a dispute from being worthless to worthwhile. Just what cooperating amounts to here, I'm going to spend like 3 slides telling you. So it's not like they're just being nice to each other, but there's some substantive stuff that I think has to go on with the common ground and questions under discussion, but we'll get to that. So that's what I'm going to spend today doing then, is convincing you that like I'm onto this new piece of what makes merely verbal disputes worthwhile. So first, I'm going to give you a more precise definition of what verbal disputes are. And then I want to sort of go through some of the work that does argue that sometimes verbal disputes can be worthwhile. I think this is going to turn out to be important because I think most of the literature gets almost to where I want to go, or at the very least gets there kind of implicitly. And because of that, I think that this is kind of what I'm going to propose is like a natural way to interpret the worthwhileness of some verbal disputes. Then I want to tell you what I mean by cooperation. And then I'll give you the test that does in fact determine the difference between worthless and worthwhile verbal disputes, or a difference, I guess. Going to motivate that in part on the basis of some work on metalinguistic questions and what it means to update the common ground. And then there's this great upshot at the end, and I'm going to leave that kind of as a cliffhanger, and we'll get there in about halfway through. Yeah, so that is the plan as it stands. So let me then tell you what verbal disputes are, right? Chalmers argues that verbal disputes, a dispute is merely verbal, when two parties, between two parties, when the two parties agree about the relevant facts of a domain of concern and just disagree about the language being used to describe the domain. So in this sense, then, what winds up happening is that everyone agrees about all the facts on the ground. It's just they're using different words to describe the things they're talking about. And this is what causes the dispute, right? It's just a miscommunication, really, on Chalmers's picture, right? So verbal disputes then occur when two people think that they are having a debate over a topic, but in the end are just talking past each other because they're using the same word to mean two distinct things, or using different words to mean the same thing or something like this, right? Merely verbal disputes then are ultimately a problem with language. Okay, so on the Chalmers picture, if you resolve the language issues, the dispute goes away. Okay, and this is the Chalmers picture is kind of a formalization of the way that merely verbal disputes had been treated in the literature, right? So here's a good example of something that might be a merely verbal dispute. Suppose we have two teachers arguing about whether Mila is an A student. Okay, they're in like the mail room and they're trying to decide maybe whether she should apply for some scholarship, and this scholarship suggests that you need to be an A student to apply. I'm not sure why, but that's how it works, right? So we have one teacher who says that she is an A student and the other one who says that she isn't, right? Unbeknownst to these two teachers, one of them thinks that being an A student requires getting A's exclusively, no A minuses in there, and the other one thinks that you can have an A minus or two and still be an A student. Okay. In the end, on the Chalmers picture, this type of thing is going to be a merely verbal dispute, right? These two teachers are having an argument about whether Mila is an A student, but in reality, they just have a different idea of what the definition of A student is. Right? They can both agree on the facts on the ground. They can both agree that in fact Mila got, I don't know, 3 A's and an A minus last semester or whatever her grades were. But they disagree about how to apply the term A student. So per Chalmers, then once we resolve what the definition of A student should be, so we turn instead to talking about the specific grades and classes or her GPA or whatever, this dispute is going to disappear, right? And so that's what makes it merely verbal. These two teachers agree on all of the facts, but they disagree about how to use the term A student. And we will, yeah. Okay, so because these disagreements are typically thought to be because of poor language choices, basically, the language choice is not specific enough in a way. Merely verbal disputes have traditionally thought to be worthless to engage in, right? So Jenkins, Chalmers, Hirsch all argue this in various places, but it's sort of like beyond just being argued. People often say things like, "Oh, that's merely verbal. Don't bother dealing with it," right? So whether it's sort of officially in print or not, just sort of the gestalt of merely verbal disputes suggests that we just don't need to bother with them, right? They're just issues of language. Once the language is sorted, we can move on and we don't need to worry about them. Okay, originally, when I was first working on this, I thought that there would be a nice way to distinguish between a worthless, merely verbal dispute and a worthwhile metalinguistic negotiation. So if you're familiar with the Plunkett and Sundell literature, on metalinguistic negotiation, it's all over the place in the conceptual engineering stuff too. The thinking is that, yeah, sometimes these disputes about language are just worthless and you can resolve the language, but sometimes these disputes about language are actually things that we use to resolve the language. So we use these disputes about language to figure out how we ought to be talking. Right, there's kind of like a normative component to them. And I was thinking that the cooperation thing we're going to talk about in a second would be a nice way to distinguish between these two. The cool thing I found out is that people have basically already said this in slightly different words, right? There is a lot of work now showing that the traditional picture, the claim that verbal disputes are always worthless, is wrong. Right? Some verbal disputes may be worthwhile, and it sort of amounts to the ones where there's sort of consequences to how you resolve the issue, right? Choosing how to use a word or how to describe something can have important distinctions, right? So the Plunkett and Sundell example is about waterboarding and torture, but you can even think like, depending on what we decide to call art, for example, and depending on what that term encompasses. Like there are different import and export taxes on things that are art versus things that are gifts versus things that are like, I don't know what else, right? But so depending on how you categorize things, things can matter. And so folks kind of picked up on this, and there's a lot of work on this. So I'm going to go through a few of them because I think it's important to kind of see where everyone's coming together. All right, so Balcerak Jackson argues that merely verbal disputes are those in which we cannot identify a mutually agreed upon question that both parties attempt to address. Right, there is no question under discussion on which the parties offer conflicting answers. Right, so the question under discussion stuff, we'll get to more details of that in a few pages, but basically the thought is if you are engaged in a dispute, presumably you're trying to answer some sort of question, right? If you're engaged in a merely verbal dispute, then there's no question there that you're both trying to answer, right? You might think there is, but you're somehow talking past each other and not actually settling on the same question. On the Balcerak Jackson picture, though, some merely verbal disputes are going to be worthwhile. Figuring out which question each party means to address and the answer to that may in fact be important and complicated. So I think, although I'm probably going to say false things now, the Balcerak Jackson paper and the follow-ups are what kind of kicked off this revolution that, oh yeah, merely verbal disputes can be worthwhile. Belleri has a series of papers in which she argues that a debate being merely verbal is not a good reason to walk away from it. So settling a merely verbal dispute for Belleri often has a practical import. Right, deciding how to speak does in fact turn on considerations that deserve being called substantial. So she thinks, for example, that verbal disputes can be shifted to disputes about metalinguistic disagreement, right, or can have ontological stake, and so are worth having and not to be dismissed sort of en masse, right? Some of them, obviously, like all disputes, some merely verbal disputes are going to be pointless, but that's not a particular feature of merely verbal disputes. That has to do with something else. Vermeulen argues that disputes are verbal when there's a mismatch between the disputant's utterance meaning and the speaker's meaning, but that still there are some types of verbal disputes that are not pointless, right? So Chalmers has this distinction where he calls some disputes partly verbal, where parties are talking past each other but actually agree, but actually like substantively disagree about some issues, right? Those disputes, for example, are still going to be worthwhile on this picture. Mankowitz argues that metalinguistic disputes, including metalinguistic negotiations, arise when speakers are understood to conversationally implicate propositions about the aptness of using certain expressions as part of conveying the contextually determined propositions, right? Again, we can see that these disputes might be worth having, since it's important to settle how we speak of things, right? Especially in cases where the particular terms we use have stakes, right? And then there's a bunch of others here, just to give two quick ones, right? Rast argues that many metalinguistic disputes we might have thought are pointless or not, since that they can be about the virtues of the underlying theories involved. QUDS argues that this is because there's some merely verbal disputes that are due to conceptual disagreements that bear resolving, right? Basically, what we see is that anytime there are sort of stakes to the dispute, whether it might matter how we use the words, or whether it might help us figure out how to like map the conceptual space, or whether it might, make our lives easier in some way to resolve the dispute and figure out what's going on, what we agree on, what we disagree on, that kind of thing. These are all merely verbal disputes that shouldn't be walked away from, at least on the picture that we're kind of getting here. So this is contrary to the traditional debate, right? The traditional sort of picture of merely verbal disputes says, no, these disputes are just about language. Nobody is talking to each other. They're all talking past each other. Everyone is missing the point. And what we see here is that, yeah, they might be talking past each other in a way, but getting over that hump, figuring out how to talk to each other makes those debates worthwhile to have. Okay? And so you can see then how I thought that this distinction between merely verbal disputes and metalinguistic negotiations might have played here, right? If merely verbal disputes were worthless disagreements about language and metalinguistic negotiations were worthwhile disagreements about language, right? Because there's some normative issue that we're addressing with the metalinguistic negotiations. Then what we're getting here is basically the same picture, just under a different name, right? So we don't have to limit ourselves to saying it's just metalinguistic negotiations that are the sort of substantive disputes, but a lot of merely verbal disputes get in there as well, right? So far then what we've got is that sometimes merely verbal disputes are worthwhile to have. Sometimes it's worthwhile to have disputes where we're slightly mistaken about the language that we're using, because resolving them might help in other places. Okay. So that I think is by and large right. I'm totally on board with all of this, right? I think that merely verbal disputes are sometimes worthwhile. Sometimes it matters what language we're using. Sometimes it matters how we speak of things. And heck, sometimes it's just fun to disagree about what counts as a sandwich, right? We can have a good time about that. But what I think is that previous work on this topic has missed one important way we can distinguish worthwhile merely verbal disputes from worthless merely verbal disputes, right? I think when folks are willing to cooperate in the right kinds of ways, they can have a worthwhile merely verbal dispute about something. So, sorry, I thought I had a slide on this next bit, but I don't. Basically, what we got with the previous group was some reasons why we might think merely verbal disputes are worthwhile, right? They help us resolve some issue, or they help us figure out which question we're trying to answer, or they help us discover some conflicts about underlying theories or something like this, right? What we didn't get was a story about what was going on with the disputants to make them worthwhile. And that's what I'm hoping to give at least the beginning of here. So we're going to take on board a really particular view about cooperation. So cooperation for us, which of course I've spelled 2 different ways on this slide. That's great. Cooperation for us is not just about like working together. It's about working together in a particular way. So disputants for us then are going to be cooperating when they can add information about the problematic language to the common ground. And I will get more on to those specifics in just a few minutes. But the previous accounts offer us some insight into why some merely verbal disputes call for resolutions, right? So we get a story about why we might need to resolve some of these things. And what I'm going to argue here is that cooperation tells us how to determine which disputes call for resolutions. A couple of the folks involved actually sort of require something like cooperation implicitly, right? Belleri mentions it as a possible marker when discussing some Gricean concerns. Vermeulen and Balcerak Jackson, I think, required implicitly because they rely on a question-under-discussion framework. So it's all kind of there already. I think, though, it's important to make it explicit because here's the upshot, the big like suspension thing. If we let ourselves, if we think of cooperation as one of the markers of a worthwhile verbal dispute, it will mean that disputants can in part control whether their dispute calls for a resolution, right? Disputants might be able to sort of take the reins in a bit, and if they act in a cooperative manner or opt to act in a cooperative manner, they can move their dispute from one that might be worthless to one that might be worthwhile, okay? And that sort of shift doesn't have to be intentional at all. But this is the big, I think, cool thing here, is that we can sort of shift whether or not a merely verbal dispute is worthwhile. And I think that this still accords with a lot of what's in the literature already, right? So folks argue, for example, Balcerak Jackson says that settling the question under discussion could be worthwhile. And so you can see that kind of thing here, right? We can in a way, decide whether it would be worthwhile to settle the question under discussion by deciding to cooperate and working together to do it. Yay, that would be so nice. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about an example, because if I'm going to argue that disputants can control whether they're having a worthless or a worthwhile merely verbal dispute, it's a bit strange to think that like just how two people engage in a dispute would so heavily affect sort of whether it should be pursued or not. All right, so here's an example. Probably several people have heard about this secretariat athlete example, right? I think it originally appeared in Ludlow, but I found it in Plunkett and Sundell. So here we have Amir and Bonnie talking about whether secretariat is an athlete. Some radio station ages ago released a list of the like top 100 athletes, or was talking about a list of the top 100 athletes. It doesn't really matter for our purposes, but secretariat made it onto this list. Okay, so assume that Bonnie and Amir have just heard this radio show. Somebody has called secretariat one of the top 100 athletes ever, and they're having a conversation about it, right? Amir says secretariat is an athlete, and Bonnie says, what? Secretariat's a horse. He cannot be an athlete. And Amir says, oh, but of course horses can be athletes, right? This is the beginning of a dispute. Bonnie and Amir are disagreeing about, well, they could be disagreeing about a number of things, I guess. It looks like they might be using athletes differently here, right? So Bonnie might be using it so that it excludes horses, and Amir is using it so that it includes horses, right? On the surface, though, of course, it's a dispute about secretariat and his status. But by my lights, this can go one of two ways, right? It could turn into a worthless dispute. Okay, so here's one way it could go. We have the same beginning. Secretary is an athlete. What? Secretary is a horse. And then Amir, of course, horses can be athlete. And Bonnie says, don't be silly, Amir, he's a horse. And Amir says, so. Okay? We learn nothing new about this conversation, right? We are here either having a dispute about secretariat or about athletes. And if we're thinking about new information that's introduced, we get none, at least not about secretariats and athletes, right? We learn that maybe Bonnie thinks that Amir's being silly. But we don't learn anything new. Bonnie and Amir don't propose adding anything new to the common ground, which I'll explain in more detail in a second, right? There's nothing else that they're treating as true for the purposes of this conversation. In effect, we wind up stuck. There's like a standstill here, right? Bonnie and Amir are, probably sort of like having a debate about whether a hot dog is a sandwich, putting their feet down in the sand and saying that they're right. Yeah, it's not going to go on for much longer, or heck, it might go on for a whole lot longer, but no progress is going to be made here. Okay. This dispute essentially can't be resolved because Bonnie and Amir aren't sort of agreeing to play the game with each other. Right? Here's another way it could go, though, right? Again, the same beginning. So Amir says secretariat's an athlete. Bonnie says, what? Secretariat's a horse. He can't be an athlete. And Amir says, oh, but of course horses can be athlete. And then instead of saying, don't be silly, Bonnie says, Google defines athlete as a person who is proficient in sports, and horses are not persons, so they cannot be athletes. And Amir says, think about what secretariat did. He of all animals surely transcends the person boundary, right? Here, it's not as though we resolved the issue, right? There's still a dispute here. There's neither Bonnie nor Amir have come to agree about anything, but they have managed to agree about some things, right? They've managed to agree about the Google definition of athlete, right? They've managed to agree that maybe the dispute is about persons and what counts as a person rather than something else. There is more information that they're both treating as true for the purposes of this conversation. And in that way, we do see some progress here, right? We are moving sort of in a forward direction, and we are closer to figuring out whether secretariat is an athlete than we otherwise would have been. certainly closer than we were in the worthless dispute, where Bonnie called Amir silly, and then Amir sort of stuck his foot in the sand and said, so what? Okay. But what does that mean? Okay. What does that mean, really? So what happens in the first dispute is that we can't get any new information that both Bonnie and Amir accept about either secretariat or athletes, right? They're not willing to sort of play the game with each other. And in a way, they're not willing to update their beliefs with any new information. So essentially what this does is it just stops the conversation short, right? If you're not willing to accept more new information, then you can't really get anywhere, right? It winds up being a little bit pointless, yeah? Whereas in the second conversation, even though Bonnie and Amir are still discussing and debating, they're at least willing to take in new information from each other, right? You could see that conversation devolving into some conversation about what it takes to be a person, or whether animals can ever be people, or whether the Google definition is really the right definition, or something like this, right? There's progress that you could make in that conversation that you couldn't make in the first. Okay? And I take it this is because of the way that Bonnie and Amir are interacting with each other and with the topic at hand. Okay? So what I've relied on so far is kind of a rough idea of what common ground and question under discussions are. Okay? We don't need a whole ton more for the purposes of this talk, but it is important that the common ground of the conversation is just sort of the set of things that people are treating as true in that conversation. So it's going to include a lot of really basic stuff, like Bonnie and Amir are both humans. Bonnie and Amir were both listening to this radio show. Secretariat won the Triple Crown, stuff like this. But it's also going to include, anyhow, sorry, there's all kinds of stuff in it, right? There's all kinds of things that Bonnie and Amir are accepting in both conversations that goes into the common ground. And then the question under discussion is just whatever question they're currently trying to answer. So this is a notion taken from Craig Roberts' work, right, on questions under discussion, significantly loosened for our purposes here, but it's also the notion that Balcerak Jackson relies on, right? A question under discussion is the question that you're trying to answer when you are engaged in a conversation. So in general, maybe even always, conversations will have a question under discussion, okay? There is some reason you're having this conversation, and that reason often takes the form of a question. So if you are having a conversation about, the weather outside today, the question under discussion might be, what's the weather like? Or should I bring a raincoat? Or should I wear pants or shorts or something like this, right? And it's going to change depending on what conversation you're having. Importantly, it doesn't have to be, it's not specific to disputes, right? Questions under discussion go for all types of conversations. Today, of course, we're concerned particularly with disputes. So our question under discussion is always going to be the question that folks are trying to answer by engaging in the dispute. In both conversations, both the worthwhile and the worthless conversation, the question under discussion is something like, is secretariat an athlete? Okay, this is what both folks are trying to answer when they engage in the dispute. In fact, this is sort of the last thing that Bonnie and Amir can agree on in the worthless verbal dispute case, right? They both agree that, yes, this is the question that we're trying to answer. And then after that, they can't really seem to get anywhere else in the conversation. They get no further. Whereas in the worthwhile case, where we're bringing up, whether secretariat's a person or not, you do kind of get a little bit further in pursuit of that question. Okay. So what does that all mean? Well, that means that we've basically got this intuition now about when merely verbal disputes might be worthwhile, right? It's when they seem to make progress on the issue at hand, right? And the issue at hand is always I think, going to be raised by a metalinguistic question, right? Verbal disputes in particular can arise when metalinguistic questions or questions about language are added to the list of questions under discussion. Okay. So metalinguistic questions are questions about language, things like what a term means, how best to use it, what's in its extension, that kind of thing. Both worthwhile and worthless verbal disputes can be triggered by these questions, right? So when Bonnie says what, right? Amir says Secretariat is an athlete, and Bonnie says, what? Secretariat's a horse, like he can't be an athlete. That's a metalinguistic question, right? This is Bonnie sort of implicitly asking about Amir's use of the term athlete. Okay, so it's a question about language, right? So because we're asking questions about language, right, and presumably because we're arguing about what the answer to this question about language is, this is going to trigger a merely verbal dispute, right? We're going to wind up in the situation, just like Chalmers suggested, where we have a dispute that's merely verbal because everyone agrees on the facts on the ground. We agree that Secretariat ran really fast. That probably undersells it a little bit, but that's okay. Agree that Secretariat won the Triple Crown. Agree that he's a horse. We can agree that, you know, most people we call athletes are humans and this kind of thing, right? But we disagree about how to use the term athlete. Sorry, I lost my train of thought for a second. So what winds up happening is we agree about the facts. We disagree about this use of language. And so Chalmers says, okay, well, that's just merely verbal. We don't have to, just don't worry about talking about that. Figure out how you want to use the term athlete and go with that. Maybe we have like athlete H and athlete A for human athletes and animal athletes or something like that, right? Just resolve the language issue and it won't matter. So this is merely verbal. What I want to argue is that some disputes like this can be worthwhile, right? And the difference is how the disputants try to answer the question, right? So once everyone agrees that this is the question we're trying to answer, we go from there and try to figure out how to answer that question. And that's what's going to tell us whether it's a worthwhile or a worthless verbal dispute. Okay. So there's three options for what happens after a metalinguistic question is accepted. Okay, so a question is accepted when everyone in the conversation agrees to answer it. So it could be that the metalinguistic question is as in our first example, right? And it attempts to answer it, generate a worthless verbal dispute. So the first example was the one where Bonnie and Amir basically called each other silly and then, you know, put down their foot, right? Or it could be that the metalinguistic question is as in our second example and attempts to answer it, generate a worthwhile verbal dispute. So this is where we're adding new information about like what Google says athletes are and, you know, whether Secretariat is a person and this type of thing. Okay. The third possibility is that there's a metalinguistic question, but there's no verbal dispute that follows, right? This would sort of align with Plunkett and Sundell's definition of metalinguistic disagreement. Basically, you can ask a metalinguistic question about all kinds of things and it doesn't have to lead to a dispute, right? You can ask sort of what a term means, you can ask how to use a term or something like that. And if the answer is just a factual answer and everyone accepts it, then there's no dispute involved. And so everyone just goes on their merry way. Right. In the end, we basically don't have to worry about number three because there's no dispute involved. There's no dispute to determine the worth of, right? So our concern is going to be mainly with telling the difference between 1 and 2. Okay, we want to figure out then when we get a worthless dispute and when we get a worthwhile dispute. I think that you can use the notion of cooperation that I discussed earlier, where participants or disputants are cooperating when they add new information about the problematic language to the common ground to distinguish between the first and second style of disputes, right? So to distinguish between worthless and worthwhile verbal disputes. Okay, so let's look at that first possibility, right? So the first possibility was the one where you asked a metalinguistic question, it was accepted by all the disputants, and you wind up with a worthless verbal dispute. Okay. Metalinguistic questions, like all questions on the question under discussion list, require cooperation to answer. You need to be willing to add new information to the common ground. You need to be willing to treat new information as true. And everyone needs to accept it in order to get an answer to that question, right? If you're not willing to treat new information as true, you just can't, well, you can't go anywhere. You can't get an answer into the common ground if you're not willing to add things to the common ground, basically, right? So disputants are going to need to agree to treat certain claims as true about the terms in question, right? They're going to need to agree to treat things about secretariat and horses and athletes as true in order to get an answer to the question, is secretariat an athlete? Right. In our example of the worthless verbal dispute, right, interlocutors, the disputants can't be said to be cooperating at all, right? They are not updating the common ground with new information about is secretariat an athlete, right? They're not really in the process of trying to answer a metalinguistic question, right? The process of trying to answer a question involves trying to get new information into the common ground that will provide an answer to the question at hand. And they're not really doing that, right? It might look like they're doing that, but because they can't agree about anything, they just can't really get anywhere, right? So questions under discussion really can't be answered unless the participants are willing to cooperate to find a solution. Since these participants are not willing to cooperate, no solution is going to be forthcoming, basically, ever, right? So that makes it look like, since the disputants in case one, where we have a worthless dispute, are not cooperating, it's that lack of cooperation that leads to the sort of futility of it, right? They're not really even working together to try to find an answer. So we wouldn't expect that an answer is forthcoming. So there's just no point in going on, right? That makes it a worthless dispute. On the other hand, right, in our second example, where we have people updating the common ground with like the Google definition of athlete and what it takes to be a person and all that, genuine attempts to answer a metalinguistic question, right, where this genuineness includes cooperation amongst the participants, triply does not trigger a worthless verbal dispute, right? Since a genuine attempt to answer requires cooperation. Okay, so when you are actually trying to answer one of these questions under discussion, you need to be cooperating to do it, because you need to be agreeing to treat as true certain new pieces of information in order to try to do that. And in the second conversation, where Bonnie adds to the common ground the Google definition of athlete, Amir implicitly treats that as true, right? When he goes on to talk about whether or not secretariat is a person. And so we get a new piece of information added to the common ground about the problematic language in question. And so these two disputants are in fact cooperating, and it leads to a worthwhile verbal dispute, right? So one marker then for a worthwhile verbal dispute is cooperation amongst the participants, which is marked by their ability to add new information to the common ground about the issue in question. Okay. So where does that leave us? And I should mention that Andrew Tedder drew me this picture because he latex much better than I do, but it's beautiful, I think. So after a metalinguistic question is asked, right, and a dispute is triggered, so we're not here in the situation where there's an easy answer and a factual answer to the metalinguistic question. In order to determine whether the triggered dispute is worthwhile, one thing we can look to is whether the disputants are cooperating by agreeing to treat as true new pieces of information about the problematic language. If they are, we'll have a worthwhile verbal dispute, and if they're not, we'll wind up with a worthless verbal dispute. Okay. Good. So that's the big takeaway here. Oh, I guess here's the big takeaway. Here's the official test then. One marker of a worthwhile verbal dispute is that the disputants are trying to cooperatively answer a metalinguistic question. Worthless verbal disputes usually do not feature this type of cooperation, right? I had originally written the paper as saying something like all all merely verbal disputes that are worthwhile have this type of feature. I don't think that's quite right, though, but this is a sort of, I think it's a good indication of when a verbal dispute is worthwhile versus when it's not. Right? Additionally, this sort of moves us one step forward from the previous literature, right? The previous literature all told us why a merely verbal dispute might be worthwhile to have. And now we know sort of one marker of that, like one way to test whether it's worthwhile to have. Okay. I want to give you a warning though first, right? This is a really nice test. It's fun, it's simple, you can say it in 3 sentences on a slide. It's not necessarily easy to apply, right? So it's not as though it's something that folks are going to be able to use in the moment to determine whether their merely verbal dispute is worthwhile. It does require a thorough analysis of each candidate dispute. And because cooperation, you can only really read off of the page what you've got, it might be hard to determine whether participants are really cooperating with each other, right? Did Amir really accept as true Bonnie's definition of an athlete, or was he just sort of placating her and, accepting it only to sort of break it down? Okay. That might not be so bad, right? One of the things that Plunkett says when talking about metalinguistic negotiations is that there's no way to establish that a given dispute is a metalinguistic negotiation other than looking carefully at the details of the case, right? And that's, we should be expecting this, right? Natural languages are subtle and complex. There's going to be no real one-size-fits-all, easy rubber stamp, like good dispute, bad dispute situation, right? Depending on the context, depending on the particular weight and the importance of resolving these things, we might find that sometimes they're very important to resolve, and so there's sort of higher stakes as to whether people are appropriately cooperating, and other times, like when we're discussing whether or not a hot dog is a sandwich, that they're lower stakes, and so the sort of cooperation bar is lower. Okay. And I think that that's okay, right? It sort of accords with the rest of the literature, and it's not as though this is supposed to be something that folks in the moment can use to determine whether they're having a worthwhile dispute. What we do get, though, as I mentioned earlier, is that interlocutors can control whether their dispute is worth their time, right? If 2 people are engaged in a dispute that they think might be worthless, one thing they can do is agree to sort of take in new information about the terms in question. Okay? If interlocutors then decide to treat what each other is saying as true for the purposes of the conversation, or if they manage to come to some compromise about some things that they're both willing to accept as true, then they can go from having a worthless verbal dispute to having a worthwhile one. And that, I think, is actually pretty cool, right? It gives us a certain amount of I don't want to say freedom, but there's a certain amount of control it can give us over whether we are engaged in something that's worthwhile or not. And this also doesn't have to be a conscious thing, right? You could imagine Bonnie and Amir have that first dispute where Bonnie says, "Don't be silly, Amir." And instead of responding by saying so, Amir responds by saying something like, "Secretariat ran faster than, all human racers, so why shouldn't we consider him an athlete?" Then Bonnie would be able to accept as new the fact that Secretariat was faster than any human, and that would contribute to it being a worthwhile verbal dispute. So it's kind of a nice feature, I think. It really sort of leaves it more open to the disputants to determine whether they're going to cooperate with each other and so have a worthwhile dispute. And interestingly, so a lot of the verbal dispute literature that does argue that it's worthless, much of this is aimed at suggesting that contemporary metaphysics is worthless, right? What this means is that we can't say that all of metaphysics is merely verbal and so worthless to pursue, or even all of philosophy, right? It's going to depend substantively on how we engage with each other. So yes, some metaphysics, worthless. Some philosophy, worthless because people just aren't willing to cooperate in the right types of ways to move the dispute forward. But definitely not all of it. And I'd hazard a guess that even not most of it, right? Much of it is still very much worthwhile. Oh, yay, thanks. That's it.